Alright guys, so wet racing has been around since, well, since the conception of racing any vehicles at all. In fact, wet conditions have been around in most sports since the dawn of time. Over the years, we've come to enjoy these wet events since usually there's something out of the ordinary and it brings an extra challenge to the athletes competing. In this case, it's the drivers adjusting their driving style to suit the wet conditions. That includes adjusting their braking points, managing their tires differently, and even taking radically different racing lines in which they can pull off some pretty mind-boggling overtakes with. So yeah, over the years, we've become accustomed to associating wet races with good races, but sadly, that's not the case anymore. But before we continue guys, please consider liking and subscribing if you do enjoy this video at any point at all. I want to start making videos more consistently and growing this channel, and to do that I need you guys to help me out. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's get back to the video. Ever since Belgium last season, the fans have been left with a sour taste for racing in tricky conditions. If you don't know, we essentially didn't have any racing at Spa in 2021 because the rain was pouring down so hard. The track was so wet and slippy that combined with the tricky nature of the Spa circuit, racing was just simply too dangerous to commence. So in the end, qualifying became the race for that weekend, a bit like Monaco if you will, but even more boring. The thing about Belgium last year is that it made sense. I mean, if you watched the broadcast for that race, you could see that it was absolutely lashing to the point that you felt genuinely bad for the fans who paid good money to be there. In hindsight, it was apparent that we probably wouldn't see much on-track action because of this. But if you've seen the Japanese Grand Prix, we just had a similar story to Belgium last year. But not in the way that you might think. You see, the conditions weren't nearly as bad as Spa last year. However, the race was postponed by 2 hours and in total we had about 40 minutes of racing. I'm happy we got to see any racing at all, and it was some pretty good racing at that. But what gets me thinking is why conditions that a few years ago would have just made for another wet race almost resulted in no racing whatsoever. Looking back, the track conditions were of course tricky and not optimal. Of course that was the case, the track was wet, but when you heard the drivers talk on the radio about how drivable the track really was, you'll notice that the main thing they were complaining about was the visibility. Now obviously we need our eyes to see, and we need to see to be able to drive. I'm pretty sure that's a very famous quote by a very famous Formula 1 driver, but that's besides the point. What I'm trying to say here is the spray coming from the cars in front made it impossible to see anything, and so racing wasn't possible. But you might be thinking to yourself, this wasn't that much of a problem in the past years. How come it is now? And the answer to that question is the new cars. If you haven't been living under a rock, you may know that this year, new regulations were introduced to make racing in Formula 1 closer. Before, the aerodynamics on the top of the cars was extremely complex. Just look at last year's cars in comparison to this year's, for example. You'll notice that a lot of the small and complicated looking fins and bits of the cars are gone. And if you look at the front and the rear wings, they now look a lot more simple. This was all done to minimize dirty air, which is essentially turbulent air coming from the complex aerostructures on a leading car, and it's passed backwards to the following car, which then has to use that turbulent air for its own aerodynamics, which ends up being not so great. And because of this, the following car loses a lot of downforce and basically makes it a lot slower in corners compared to the leading car in clean air. I hope you guys understood what I just said. But yeah, because the new cars don't have all the complex fins and the like on top of the car to create downforce, they need to create downforce from something else. And that is from the new Venturi tunnels underneath the new cars. Basically, the method used is called ground effect, and it creates downforce by being low to the ground, and the Venturi tunnels create a sort of vacuum effect underneath the car, which essentially sucks the car to the ground. Now, the reason the spray coming from all the cars now in wet conditions is so big is because of this ground effect. It seems that now the water seems to be shot out of the back of the car in a much more violent manner, which basically blinds the following driver. Notice how every single wet race this season has been postponed or red flagged? Were the conditions this year so much worse than last year's? No, not really. Sure, we seem to have had more wet races, but in terms of how wet, they appear to have been as wet as any other wet race before. Seriously, it's almost as if they forgot that these cars have to be able to race in the rain as well as in the dry. So really, the big problem F1 has now is that no matter how wet the track is, the water spray from the cars in the front will be bigger than they ever have been because of these new aero regulations. Up until they solve it, of course. We are talking about F1 at the end of the day, the pinnacle of motorsport, and I'm sure it will only be a matter of time until they solve this issue. But until then, I think wet races will remain as boring and as undrivable for the drivers as they have been this season. But that was all my take on it. If you do have anything to add or just want to say something, please do so in the comments below. It really helps out with the algorithm. And if you did enjoy this video at any point at all, please consider liking and more importantly, subscribing to help with the growth of this channel. But really guys, thank you all so much for watching, and on that note, I hope you all have a blessed night, and I'll catch you all next time.